Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Begin with the name of God, the most merciful, the eternally merciful. And we express our praise and our gratitude to the divine, and we seek blessings upon the Prophet, peace be upon him. So my assignment is to speak to you today about the role of the divine, the role of divine revelation as guidance, especially in the search or the development of knowledge. Now, there's a few ways we can address this question. One way to address this question is just by the nature of how Islamic history plays out. That's point number one. Point number two is to address this question according to the Quranic understanding, the Quranic depiction of human nature, and how does that play out in terms of the quest for knowledge. And then point number three, how does that play out for us today? So the first point is to look at the role of Islamic thought, Islamic practice, the search for knowledge in history. The second is the depiction of the human being and what that means in relationship to knowledge. And then number three, what does that mean for us today, especially in the context of the quest for the divine. So first and foremost, some of this will be reviewed for Muslims in this room or Muslims who've taken an Islam 101 type class here or elsewhere. In Muslim doctrine, the first revelation that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, receives is a revelation instructing him to read and to recite. Iqra, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. So read in the name of your Lord who created you. Now there's a few ways to understand this passage. First and foremost, that the very, very, very first communication that the Prophet, peace be upon him, receives is an instruction telling him to read, telling him to recite. Now, if you think about it, when we read, what is the basic goal of reading? The basic goal of reading is acquisition. What is the acquisition of? The acquisition of knowledge. And to take that point further, what are you getting when you are getting knowledge? You are entering into the realm of the unknown. What is the basic purpose of knowledge? It's to take you from the known into the unknown. So whatever your majors are, some of you are biology majors, some of you are physics majors, some of you are humanities majors, some of you are social work majors, you're not entering your field as an expert. You're entering your field with this big realm of unknown. This is the destination I want to get to, which is a degree or what have you. And knowledge is doing what? It's taking me from the known to the unknown. What else is that teaching us? What else is that teaching us? That the key to entering into the unknown, or one fundamental key for entering into the unknown, is itself by way of knowledge. Think about what frightens you. Right? All of us have fear. It might be fear of the dark. Right? It might be fear of the future. Like when I speak to undergrads, the question that I don't like asking, but I have to, the questions that undergrads don't like getting asked is, what are you going to do after you graduate, right? Because that's a question related to the unknown. And so one of the cures for the fear of the unknown is knowledge. Right? Now, what else relates to fear? That you cannot have fear without having hope, right? Because what is fear by definition? Fear is, I'm afraid this is going to happen, but I hope it will not happen. What is hope? Hope is, I'm hoping that this will happen, but I'm afraid it will not happen. By definition, fear and hope cannot be separated from each other. So what else is knowledge giving you? Right from the start, right from the first revelation. We said the first revelation is that the Prophet, peace be upon him, is instructed to acquire knowledge. And from there, it's taking you from the known into the unknown. It's helping you to understand the unknown by making it known. In addition, it is turning fear into hope. That one of the consequences of acquiring knowledge is to transform fear into hope. Right? We have a teaching, very common not only in Islamic tradition, but in other traditions, that we fear what we don't know. You see it playing out in our society with the amount of bigotry and hatred that we see. That the bigotry and hatred is directed toward people that we don't know. We might know them according to stereotypes, we might know them according to the stereotypes of the stereotypes. So, what else is a function of knowledge? Right from the very first command that the Prophet receives, peace be upon him, is to convert fear into hope. Right from the very first revelation. Now, how does this then further play out, even further? That the ultimate knowledge works at essentially 5 levels. One level of knowledge is knowledge of the self. Who are you? One of the points that many of you might have faced here starting out as undergrads is that you might realize, or you might come to this point where you find yourself thinking, okay, I don't know anything about myself. If you haven't had that experience, you probably will sooner or later. What do I really know about even myself? Especially if you've lived under the protection of high school and grade school, which is often the protection of your parents. And in college, that protection loosens up a little bit, and then when you're out of college, that protection goes away even further. Right? And so one realm of knowledge that you get, that you seek, is knowledge of the self, finding out who you are. What does that mean? Finding out who you are in terms of your history. How is it that you were this person with this family that goes back X number of generations to the point that you brought you here? What else is the knowledge of the self? Even deeper than that is to know how you tick. Right? What is it that makes me happy? What is it that makes me sad? What is it that makes me hopeful? What is it that makes me fearful? Knowledge of the self. Another benefit or another goal of knowledge is to know knowledge of 2 parts of the environment. One is the community that you live in. Part of the knowledge of the self involves knowing who is in your environment. You are here at a Jesuit institution, which automatically makes it different than a secular institution like University of Chicago, which makes it automatically even different than something like St. Xavier, which is also a Catholic institution, but it is not run by Jesuits. Who runs St. Xavier? Anybody know? Nuns. Right? A very, very different environment. But what is the benefit of knowing your environment? You also begin to know your place in the environment. You also begin to know your role in the environment. Now, this is especially a challenge in our era because we're in the social media era, right? We're in the personal media era, right? Where I can go through the entire day and not ever even see a person face to face. Right now, you don't experience it as much because you're in class with 1 million people for each class. Okay? What about those days you don't have class? How much time do you spend with other people? Well, you might have roommates. Wait till you graduate. Wait till you graduate and you are not going to be in a daily environment on a campus with X thousand people. You will see your bubble will begin to take over for you more and more. There was a recent piece both in the New York Times as well as NPR, literally like in the last 2 weeks, saying that the number of people who live alone has been skyrocketing in American society. And there's some consequences to this. That demographics in American society are changing faster than they have in any major society in human history. That to keep a society active, to keep a society alive, you have to have every family has to have 2.1 kids or something like that, right? Now in Europe, already those demographics have been collapsing. But now in America, they're beginning to collapse even further. But someone else is going to be living here, who knows? Whoever it is having the most kids. It historically was the Catholics, but it's not even the Catholics anymore. So one goal of knowledge is knowledge of the self. A second goal of knowledge is knowledge of point 2b, your environment. Point 1, point 2b, and then point 2a. Knowledge in terms of your community. And why? It's also to figure out what is your role, what is your place in society. Now you can go through life without knowing anything about yourself. You can go through life without knowing anything about your community, but it will not be a very fulfilling life. So 1 is to know yourself, 2b is to know your community, 2a is to know nature around us. Right. For example, we have many Muslims in the room. If I ask them, how do you know what time is the next prayer time, what are they going to do? I'll tell you. Right? Okay. Historically, how do we know the prayer times? It's by the position of the sun. Right? Historically, how do we know when the new month begins? It's the position of the moon. That central to the quest of knowledge is not only to know your society, but also to know your world. Okay. So one quest for knowledge is to know yourself. Another quest of knowledge is to know your community. Another quest of knowledge is to know the world around you. And all of you are more conscious of this than we were when I was an undergrad, because this is more so in our air, that we have to be conscious about our environment, because we are devouring it, and because the amount of our environment that we have left is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. Which raises the question of what are we leaving as a legacy for our grandchildren? What are we leaving as a legacy for our great-grandchildren who we might not even think about? So what is the world that we are leaving? This becomes a consequence. Like there is a teaching in the Quran that God is al-warith. He is the inheritor. And if you know the Latino name Alvarez, it comes from the same word, al-warith. And what is the point here? That everything that you have, you will be handing off back to the divine when it is time for you to go. What you have done with the world, you are handing back to the divine. So, you're getting to know yourself. You're getting to know your community. You are getting to know the environment. Number 4, actually, don't worry about my numbering system, it'll be confusing. And that is those who communicate with the divine. Now, how does, in our tradition, how does in Islamic tradition God communicate with the divine? Primarily, but not exclusively, primarily by these people who are appointed, called prophets, peace be upon them. These are people throughout history who God has specifically appointed. And we'll talk about their mission in just a moment, but who are these people? These are people of perfect character. These are people who are intellectually brilliant. Now keep this point in mind, including the Muslims in the room. When you imagine prophets, what do you think of? Often in our contemporary Muslim culture even, we think of prophets as people of authority, but we don't often think about them as people. That these are people with perfect character. In our general Western tradition, we don't think of humanity as being perfect or capable of being perfect. We often say God is perfect, humans are not. No, God is perfect, but humans can also be perfect as humans. So, who are these prophets? These are people with perfect character. These are people of intellectual brilliance. These are people who have perfect compassion. So what else is knowledge connecting you to? Knowledge, or a goal of knowledge, is to connect you to those people who are connected to the divine. Now the divine speaks to humanity by way of these prophets. But the divine also speaks to each and every one of us by the other methods that I just mentioned. But the divine speaks to us by way of our environment. Those of you who've taken my classes, you know the next example I'm going to give. Okay? Suppose you're walking down the street and you see a leaf falling from a tree. Ask yourself, what is the first thing that comes to mind? The first thing that, if you are raised in the Midwest, if you're raised maybe even to some degree in the South, but especially the Midwest, when you see a leaf falling from a tree, the first thing that comes to mind is probably fall. It's probably autumn. Why? Because that's what you have been socially conditioned to think. When I raise the same question to someone who was raised in, say, India, that person says, okay, leaves fall from a tree all the time, we don't think about it. Okay. But if you're raised in this environment, you're conditioned to think that when a leaf falls from a tree, that fall is coming. Maybe the school year is beginning. Maybe you have to think about where your coats are. Okay. Now, what is the point that I'm making here? That everything you see, everything you hear, you give meaning to. When you walk into this room and you see whoever's sitting wherever, you're automatically interpreting. When you look at the lighting in this room, you're automatically interpreting. When you walk out and you feel that gust of warm air, you are interpreting. In any given minute, you might be interpreting 400 things, one after the other, without even thinking about it. Right? Somebody walks in, automatically you're interpreting. And most of what you are interpreting is socially conditioned. It's conditioned by the way you were raised. It's conditioned by the society that you were in. Now, what are we saying here? I said that God speaks to humanity one way, by way of these perfect individuals throughout history that we call prophets. And in Islamic tradition, the final of those specific people is the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who lived 1400 years ago. But the communication of God with humanity does not end with him. That when you see a leaf falling from a tree, God in that moment is communicating with you. When you see a cloud in the sky, God in that moment is communicating with you. When you see another person, God in that moment is communicating with you. But your ability to understand what he is saying to you has been filtered by the way you've been socially conditioned to understand. So when a leaf is falling from a tree, God is saying something to you. But before you can hear anything, you've already interpreted what the leaf is saying to mean fall. So part of the function of prophets is also to be models. How do you develop this interaction with the divine so that you are in communication with the divine 24/7? Everywhere you are walking, everywhere you are seeing something, everywhere you are hearing something, even when you are asleep, that the function of the prophets, peace be upon them, is to become this model on this interaction with the divine. But what prevents us from taking them as models, from what prevents us from getting closer to the divine, one veil is the social conditioning that we are working with and working against. So you can reach a point where a leaf falling from a tree is not so much a sign of fall as much as it is a sign of the divine. So I just mentioned that every time I see something, I'm interpreting it. I can get to a point in my connection with the divine that everything I see, I said you might interpret 400 times in a minute, 400 things I notice in a minute, I'm reminded of the divine. Think about that. It's one thing for me to think about the divine, it's something entirely different for everything in my environment to constantly be reminding me of the divine. Okay? And notice the word I'm using, sign. In Arabic, this is ayah, A-Y-A-H, ayah. So I'm saying that everything is a sign of something. The goal of the very first revelation of the Quran is to guide you, to lead you to what? Get knowledge of the self. 2, get knowledge of your community. 3, get knowledge of your environment. 4, get knowledge of the prophets. And what is the knowledge of the prophets giving you? Number 5, knowledge of God. To interact with the divine. So now we have 3 levels here of interaction with the environment. 1, you see a leaf falling from a tree, you're socially conditioned to think of fall. But as you get closer to the divine, you see a leaf falling from a tree, and it reminds you of God. And then even deeper than that, you see a leaf falling from a tree, and it is communication. 2-way communication between you and the divine. And that is something that each and every one of us is capable of having. But it takes effort. And the starting point is the quest for knowledge. The quest of knowledge that will benefit you, not seeking knowledge that will not give you any benefit. I can rattle off stats of the 1985 Chicago Bears. And that's about as useful as hitting myself with a rock, right? It's not very useful at all. Well, I mean, I could probably make some friends. They're probably my age, sitting on a bus or something, right? Dwelling in the past. So, question? And feel free to interrupt with any questions. Yeah, that means I have less that I need to talk about to fill up the time. Yeah.
Are you trying to say that so in order to have the knowledge of God interactions, you should get into the knowledge of self first?
Oh, great question. Okay, so am I essentially saying that to have knowledge of interaction of God, do I need to have knowledge of the self first? The answer is both yes and no, but especially yes. So let me explain. How to connect to the divine, the pathway to do that is the prophets, right? They are the teachers. But the first step is the knowledge of the self. Right? Knowledge of the self, there's a very famous teaching in Islamic tradition. Again, we have a very similar teaching in other traditions, that to know yourself is to know God. Right? That once you know yourself thoroughly, then you are now opening yourself up to actually connect to the divine. So yeah. So we said that from this first revelation that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, received, we have automatically 5 levels or 5 types of knowledge that the person, the believer, is being taught to seek. Knowledge of the self, knowledge of the community, knowledge of the environment, knowledge of the prophets, and knowledge of the divine. Now, how does this play out in terms of Islamic history? So Islamic history is a history of 1400 years. If we speak of Islamic history beginning with the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. But those of you who've taken my class, and you've probably taken other classes, that from within Islam's paradigm, Islamic history actually begins with the first human Adam. Right? It's just that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the completion of this one phase where God speaks specifically to specific humans to make them official teachers for all of mankind. But then we are also taught that the scholars are the inheritors of the prophets. The scholars are the inheritors of the prophets. Meaning, once the prophets are gone, who is it that continues their legacy? The prophets. Now let me distinguish between a scholar and a clergyman. A scholar does not have authority. But the prophets, they have authority. They tell you, this is what you have to do because God says so. This is what you should not do because God says so. This is how you should live because God says so. And what does it mean if God says so? It means it's better for you. What does it mean to stay away from such and such things? It means it's better for you. Meaning it's not just mere dogma. That things that you're prescribed to do are beneficial. Things that you're prescribed not to do are considered to be harmful. Now the scholars in our tradition are considered to be the inheritors of the prophets. And what is the basic curricula of the scholars? And what I'm saying is, what is the basic curricula that you find in an Islamic seminary that we call a madrasa? In contrast to a university. It's a very, very simple difference. That in the Western academic system, which we're all part of, which is what I teach in, what is the goal of the university? What is the goal of all these fields of inquiry? Biology, chemistry, physics, philosophy, literature, so forth and so on. It's to understand how does the world work. Right? It's to understand how does the world work. What is psychology all about? Understanding how does the human work. What is anthropology all about? How do humans behave. Right? What is sociology all about? How do people congregate and what are the institutions they form and how do they work? What is physics all about? How does the universe work? What is chemistry all about? How does the universe work at the molecular level and beneath? And then they begin to merge into thermodynamics and such. Okay? That is how our fields of inquiry work in the academy. In the seminary, what is the philosophy? It's to find out what does God want from us. Now the two will overlap, but they're two different approaches. In the seminary, what does God want for us? What does He want from us? What does He want for us? And what does that mean? It means knowledge of the text. You start from knowledge of the text. So the primary text in Islamic tradition is the text that we call the Quran. Now, I have to make a side point about miracles. Because when we define miracles in our culture, we often define miracles according to science. That something is a miracle if it is an anomaly, right? Something is a miracle if it cannot be explained by science, right? So we call those things miracles. Now the deeper question, I'm guessing everyone here who has any sort of belief probably believes that there are miracles, whether or not any of us have actually witnessed any. Miracles according to that definition. The problem is that that's not how miracles always play out. I think that we have 7 billion people in the world, each with an individual consciousness. I think it's nothing short of a miracle. It's just that it happens 7 billion times. We just don't think about it because it's common. Or the process of birth, the process of procreation, I think is mind-boggling. But we don't think of it as a miracle because it happens 1,000,000 times a day. So what am I saying? That even within these traditions, when we speak of something like a miracle, we define them according to our traditions. So according to our Western academic cultural sense, how do we define a miracle? It violates science. It happens only once. But I'm saying that something that happens all the time can easily be a miracle. We don't have an explanation yet for consciousness. We may never have an explanation for consciousness. We have a belief that someday we'll be able to explain it through neurology and such. But now, what is the point that I'm making here? Another is that in redefining miracles, there's the strong issue of timing. That miracles often happen at the perfect place at the perfect time. So we know the story of Moses in the Islamic tradition, in Jewish tradition, in Christian tradition, Moses is leading his people, his 600,000 followers, away from the persecution of the Pharaoh. They arrive at the sea. Moses takes his staff, hits it on the rock, the water splits, and then they walk through. So suppose that happened 2 hours late. So he hits the staff, they're waiting, Pharaoh's people come, they wipe everybody out. And then the sea splits. Is it still a miracle? Well, it contradicts science, but the point is that it did not happen when it needed to happen. So what I'm saying is that when we imagine miracles, don't assume that a miracle is something that can only happen once. And 2, understand also that things that are meaningful to us, things that are miraculous to us, often happen at the perfect time. But there's another point. That in the Islamic tradition, one of the miracles of the Islamic tradition, I'll give you 2 of them, of the Islamic tradition, that are again so commonplace that nobody thinks about them. So commonplace that Muslims themselves don't think about them. One is the preservation and the perpetuation of the Quran. Muslims, when often speaking about miracles, will say that, look, the Quran talks about the splitting of the salt water and the fresh water, and how could someone 1,400 years ago in a desert know this? The Quran talks about the formation of the embryo. How could somebody 1,400 years know about any of this? Or look at the passages on the universe. How could somebody 1,400 years ago know any of this? That's all valid. But what about something right before your very eyes? That Muslims preserved not only the Quran word for word, not only how every single individual letter in each of those words is pronounced, because you might have the letter R, and in this case it's pronounced Ra, in that case it's pronounced Ra. Right. Not only is each individual letter preserved, but also the pauses between the letters and between the words are also preserved. That when Muslims speak of the Quran being preserved, we're not speaking only about the miraculous passages. We're speaking about the letters, how each letter is pronounced in each specific syllable, as well as the pauses in between. Just try to comprehend this fact, that the pauses in between words are being preserved. That's one. The other, that is one of the primary methods of connecting to the divine, and that is in the act of prayer. You've all seen it, the act of the Muslim prayer. Ask every single Muslim in this room, how did he or she learn how to pray? And they might start from a book, they might start from a video, they might start from the internet, but when do you really learn how to pray? You learn how to pray from somebody else. You really learn how to pray when you are praying in congregation or when you have a one-to-one teacher. And that person was taught by someone, who's taught by someone, who's taught by someone, who's taught by someone, going back 1,400 years. And then you see this in action when you go, for example, to the pilgrimage in Mecca. And again, we've all seen video footage of this. What do you see? We have this population of 1.5 billion people. And if you look in the Muslim majority countries, they are rightly criticized for having the lowest levels of literacy over and over again, just about every country that you go to, except a few examples like Iran and Turkey, a little bit of Malaysia. Right. Yet, not only is the Quran preserved right down to the pauses in between the words, but the form of prayer is also preserved. I would say that's a miracle. If you really think about it, how is it that there's no central body here? Islam in general is just like the Protestant church. There's no central body. How is it that in these populations where you have such high illiteracy, and there's no manual, there's no book that you would say, okay, this is a book that teaches you how to pray. Okay? There's no manual that's getting published all around the world. Yet, you have this population of people all praying almost exactly the same way. What are the differences? Probably about 5 and 20%, and 20% is probably an exaggeration. And I'm saying all the major sectarian groups, the Sunnis, the Shias, as well as a third group nobody knows about, called the Ibadis. So, what is the point that I'm making here? The side point I'm making here is reevaluate what you think of when you think of miracles. So I'm saying that those two things I think are unexplainable. You can say scientifically, all right, this person is learning from this, you're learning from this, you're learning from this, but how does it play out? So 1 billion people pray identically. But what is the deeper point I'm making? Why are these things being preserved? Because they are connections to the divine. They're being preserved because they are considered to be so precious that the first instruction of the Quran is to read. What is the goal? Is to develop this knowledge. What is the ultimate knowledge? It's your connection with the divine. And so thus those two sources become vitally precious to the believer. And that is at the core of the tradition of Islamic scholars. Not so much preserving the Quran, not so much preserving prayer, but starting from there and developing entire sciences focused on how to connect with the divine. Now, further, in terms of Islamic thought, there are just a few specific fields of Islamic learning. Okay, I'll list you all the 9 primary fields of Islamic learning that you're going to get in a seminary, from least relevant to most practical. Least relevant, but that are taught one is history. Why is it relevant? Why am I saying it's least relevant? Because if you don't know it, it doesn't change your life today very much. It gives you insights. Okay? It gives you a sense of the self. But if you don't know it, you are not missing as much. Another is philosophy. I personally love philosophy thoroughly. But philosophy is a privilege of the elite. It is not as practical because it focuses on the abstract. And then the third one at this base level is what we would call theology. Now, theology in Islam and theology in Christianity are 2 different things. But theology is essentially Islam's method of making Islam more practical. Okay. How? By understanding how does the whole tradition work. Theology in the Christian sense, there's a few categories there, but ultimately what is it about? It's about being. That field is often addressed in Islam by law, which we'll get to. Another core field of Islamic knowledge is the sciences of the Quran. Not so much the memorization of the Quran, not so much acting upon the Quran, but what is the whole history of the text? What is the history of interpretation of the text? Which again, a common believer, if he or she does not know this, it's irrelevant. Another is the science of the history of the knowledge that we have of the prophets. Now, what is that? That's volumes and volumes of raw material. When we look at the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, we have as many as 1 million narrations all about him. What do the people around him see him do? Again, looking at him as the most precious person in their environment, the most upright person in their environment, and a person who has a special connection to the divine. There's 1 million, maybe 2 million narrations. How many laces did his sandals have? How tall did he seem to be? How did he walk? When he smiled, how did he smile? When he interacted with his family, how did he interact with them? Noting down everything right down to the smallest detail. But again, if you are someone who does not know those details, it does not change things for you as much. Higher than that is the knowledge of the language of these texts. Again, not as relevant for us, but I'm sharing it to you just to give you an idea of what takes place in a seminary. This is knowledge primarily of Arabic, because that was the language of the Quran. I can read the Quran in translation, and I can understand the whole of Islam right down to some very, very serious points without any knowledge of Islam. But if I want to dig even deeper, naturally I want to read it in Arabic. Just like if I want to read the Bible right down to its core, I need to know ancient Greek. I need to know Hebrew. And then if I want to go further to connect myself to Jesus, peace be upon him in the Islamic tradition, I need to know Aramaic. The most practical fields are the fields of law and purification. Now, what am I saying here? That in the realm of Islamic law, the focus is on guiding you in terms of how you interact with society. How do you interact? How do you behave? The other one I said is purification, which brings us back to our first knowledge, knowledge of the self. I said that what is it that's preventing me from looking at that leaf falling from a tree as a communication from God, or at least a reminder of God? It's my conditioning. Purification in Islamic tradition is the field, is the science, I'll explain that term in a moment, that focuses on bringing you back to your pure self. And your default pure self is an innate goodness and innate connection with the divine. This is purification. So what else are we saying? That in this paradigm, humans are innately good. Humans have an innate connection to the divine, but it gets cluttered. It gets cluttered by the way you live. It gets cluttered by the world around you. And purification is focused on purifying that, helping you regain control of yourself so you can automatically connect with the divine. Now, that's how Islamic thought, how Islamic knowledge played out in history. Now, the last point, which is much shorter because the room is very hot and I'm getting very hot, is to actually think about the idea of the human in this tradition. The human has 4 parts. One part is the soul. What is the soul? We have very little knowledge. It is a special connection with the divine. We have an idea of how the soul works from within the tradition. Another part is the body, your physical body. Another part is the mind. And another part, the fourth part, is the heart. The soul, the body, the mind, the heart. The soul, the body, the mind, the heart. Now, how does each of these four parts work? Each of these four parts within you has what we would call, in simple language, thirst. The thirst of the body is to be quenched by connecting to creation. Your physical hunger, your need for attention. Right? What is that? It's about connecting to people. Your sense of loneliness, where does that come from? It's a need to connect to people, to connect to creation. Your physical appetites, what is that? Again, a need to connect to creation. That is an innate hunger and innate thirst that each and every one of us has. The thirst of the mind is what we would call curiosity. And how does that get quenched? By the acquisition of knowledge. What is the function of the mind? It's to process. It's your rational intellect. The thirst of the heart is to connect to the divine. That every emotion you feel from a bodily perspective is what? It's a physiological action, right? So if I'm experiencing happiness, okay, this is what's taking place physically in my brain. Okay? This is what's taking place in my body, and a physician or a physiologist can understand happiness, sadness, depression, hope at a physiological level. Whereas a neurologist would understand all of that as a product of the brain. Now, what am I saying here? That everything you experience, if you look at it from the window of your body, is a question of whether or not your body's innate hunger is being fulfilled, or is it being fulfilled in a healthy or a non-healthy way. That leads to all these experiences that you have. That affects how you look at the world. If you eat some nasty food, it will affect you emotionally. The mind, if you look at the mind, the feelings that you experience, the emotions you experience, a sense of contentment or lack of contentment from the window of the mind relates to the knowledge and the filters that you've been educated with. Knowledge is a form of liberation, but it can also be a form of prison. That's why you need to keep acquiring knowledge. Now, the heart is the king. Your feelings, whatever it is you're feeling, actually relate to how close or how far are you from the divine. So the body relates to its physical appetite, the mind relates to its intellectual curiosity, and the heart, what is the hunger of the heart? It is yearning. And what is the ultimate yearning? It is to connect to the divine. Now let's do this as an exercise. You're not going to share anything. This is something I want you to think for yourself. I want you to think of something deep down inside that you really, really, really wish you could have. Now here's the challenge. Those of you who make prayers on a regular basis, chances are you've already censored yourself from these things. Those of you who do or do not make prayers, but you're just growing up for society, they're way, way, way in the back of your mind. What are those really deep things that you want? It might be to be reconnected with someone that you've lost. What are those deep things that you want? Maybe you want validation from a parent. What are the deepest things that you want? You know you're getting close to your heart when you start feeling vulnerable. And if you can understand that feeling, what is that feeling? That is a feeling of yearning. That is getting closer to your heart. Your body has a form of intellect. We call it your sensory intellect. Your mind has your rational intellect. Your heart has your intuitive intellect. And the hunger of the body is this physical hunger. The hunger of the mind is curiosity. And the hunger of the heart is yearning. What I'm saying in this paradigm, that deep yearning you have, even deeper than that, is for a reconnection with the divine. That if you develop an increasing reconnection with the divine, those pains that are all the way in between from that connection to where you feel right now, most or all those will get resolved. So then what is the goal of knowledge from the perspective of the being? Is to give yourself healthy fulfillment for all the different yearnings that you have. And then what does the consequence of knowledge bring you to today? It is health. What we would in our language call physical health, mental health, but deepest of all, spiritual health. And what does that mean from there? It is fulfillment. That as this tradition is calling on its first instruction to its first follower to read, what is it telling you to do? It is telling you to learn who you are so that you can fulfill who you are capable of being. Just like you have a gardener who is planting a seed in the ground with the goal of giving it the best nutrients, the best water to raise it as the most bright, most vivid flower that flower can be. That is what the overall goal of knowledge is. To guide you to fulfill the person you can be. It requires all of you. Your body, your mind, your heart. And then what is the soul? The soul is all three of those, the other three put together. Right? Fulfillment of those brings contentment into the soul. Now that, in a nutshell, is the role of knowledge in our tradition. That is essentially the role of knowledge starting from the Quran. The Quran is your foundation giving you this. And as you read through the Quran, what do you see? Much of the Quran is focused on the meanings that you give to the world. So that's where a lot of this starts with. So with that, thank you very much for your time. And if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to entertain anything. Otherwise, have a good day. Any questions about anything at all? Okay, not bad, about 45 minutes. Okay, otherwise, I teach, I'm adjunct in the part of theology. If you have any questions, you can get my email from them or from some of your buddies in